You may remember how in last week's tutorial I showed you the major difference between the two file types, PNG and JPEG. Although this might seem at first like the tutorials got sidetracked, this difference is actually critical for some of the select tools that I will go over, as they can be very sensitive to changes in color caused by compression. In Photoshop and GIMP, there are the rectangle select, circular aka elliptical select, and the fuzzy select aka the magic wand, which will select areas of a similar color. In GIMP only, you can also select every single area at once in an image of similar colors using the appropriately named Select by Color tool. There is also a tool exclusive to GIMP called the Foreground Select tool, which allows you to make a polygon-shaped selection of foreground parts of an image. In Photoshop, many of the select tools are hidden in a drop-down menu provided when you right-click similar tools to them. For example, the circular select tool is on the rectangular select tools menu instead of being a separate option. However, in GIMP, every tool has its own individual button. The first two tools are pretty self-explanatory and work exactly like the rectangle and circle tools I demonstrated in the first video. However, if you go to the Tool Options tab in GIMP, you will see there is a checkbox to allow the rectangle to have rounded corners. You can also change whether it fixes the proportions of both sides, aka the aspect ratio, the width only, the height only, or that it stays in exact pixel dimension and never grows or shrinks beyond that. All of these lock options work by either clicking the check mark next to the word fixed or holding the shift key while making a selection. You can also checkmark whether to feather the edges, which creates a sort of pillow shape, and you can also checkmark whether it expands from the center rather than the top left corner. You can also see position and size variables beneath the checkmarks, but these automatically update whenever you create a new selection. There are also features at the bottom of the menu that help you with your selection, which are the highlight and the guides. The highlight works by darkening the area around the selection. With the more opacity, the darker the highlight around it is. The guides come in a drop-down menu beneath the highlight option and work by splitting the selection evenly into smaller ones, depending on which one you choose. Most of the guide titles are pretty obvious what they do, but the one that is not so clear, golden sections, works by having bigger rectangles in the corners and a small square in the center. This is a reference to the golden ratio, which is applied in some painting and architecture designs, but is not often used in game design. You can also determine the different modes at the top. The default mode replaces the current selection you have with a rectangle, like so. There is also an option to add, subtract, and intersect your current selection. If you do not see the Tool Options tab by default, click the arrow in the box on the very right end of the window, and then hover over Add tab, and there should be Tool Options at the very top. On Photoshop, however, the tool options should automatically come up as soon as you select the tool. The circle tool has all of the same options as the rectangular select tool, except for rounded corners, which logically makes sense because a circle is rounded by definition. The Magic Wand tool is also customizable. In GIMP, you can decide whether it treats diagonal pixels as connected or not via a checkbox, change whether it uses the entire image or only the current layer to determine the selection, again using a checkbox, and the threshold, aka the maximum color difference within the area, using a slider. As you can imagine, the lower the threshold, the less colors you'll be able to select at once, while the greater the threshold, the more colors. There is also a checkbox to draw the mask of the layer that you have selected, but we do not have much use for it now because we have not gone to making layer masks yet. In Photoshop, the Magic Wand tool works entirely differently. In particular, the threshold slider is now replaced with specific color ratios, and you also cannot select diagonally or on the entire image. It will only select the specific layer. There is also a new Object Select tool on the most recent Photoshop versions, but I would not use that because it is not as accurate as the old-fashioned Magic Wand. The last option that GIMP has that Photoshop does not is the ability to change whether you select all the channels at once, or a specific channel such as red, green, blue, or the alpha channel. There is also an option to select by hue, saturation, or value variables discussed in the second tutorial. And also an option for lightness, chroma, and hue. We often do not use those values. The Magic Wand tool is a great example of why I taught JPEG versus PNG compression first, because it is very sensitive to slight color changes caused by JPEG compression. The Color Select tool exclusive to GIMP has all the same options as the Magic Wand, except for diagonal selections, which makes sense because it selects all the colors in one image instead of just the colors within one area of an image. Now that we have fully gone over the shape and regions of select tools, we may discuss the freehand tools. In GIMP, the freehand tool has no options except for feather edges. How it works is, if you click and drag the regular way, it will work exactly like making polygons in the first video. However, if you hold Shift while making your selection, you are able to do it a lot more freely. and basically make any shape you want. However, in Photoshop, the freehand select tool has a drop-down menu. With true freehand as the first option, a polygon select tool as a separate third option, and an option between these two named the magnetic select tool. The magnetic select tool functions similar to a polygon select tool, except if you are selecting a defined shape area, it will attempt to automatically stick to the edges of the area, much like a magnet, hence the name. Although GIMP does not have a magnetic select tool, it does have its own form called the scissor select. There is also a checkbox for interactive boundaries, which means that as you click and drag your point, it will attempt to fit the curve for you, rather than waiting for you to finish your point and make it official. This is especially helpful if you need the tool to be as precise as possible, so that you don't have to guess beforehand what your selection will look like. One last thing to note about any type of selection is that in Photoshop, you can invert the selection, which means that you make the selected unselected and vice versa, by going to select at the top and then inverse. While in GIMP, you can either do this or simply hold Control and hit I. Now that we have gone over all of the select tools, we can go over the freehand drawing tools. In Photoshop, there are only the pencil, paintbrush, and eraser tools. There is also a check mark in the paintbrush options to make it simulate an airbrush, while in GIMP, the airbrush tool is a separate tool, and there is also an ink tool that is not in Photoshop. The brush and pencil tool work by applying preset images, known formally as brushes, at a constant rate as you click, hold down, and drag the cursor, like so. Brushes can be downloaded from the web, similar to gradients, and are stored with the ABR file extension. In addition to selecting the exact type of brush you want, you can also adjust the size, the aspect ratio, with a positive number meaning the length is n times greater than the height, and a negative ratio meaning the opposite thing. The angle rotates the image by a degree clockwise if it is positive, and counterclockwise if it is negative. You can also adjust spacing, which determines how far apart, aka spaced, each image is. Hardness refers to how hard each instance of the image is. Confusingly, it is actually harder the lower the bar is. Force acts as an opacity for each instance of the brush. With a pencil, you cannot change it, but with a paintbrush, you can. The airbrush tool uses a varying opacity as opposed to a constant one, with the rate slider determining the speed the color is applied, meaning that greater rates will have darker colors, and flow determining how hard the airbrush is applied. The greater the flow, the greater the thickness of each image. The ink tool in GIMP is slightly more complicated than all the other freehand drawing tools. It generally works by changing in size more as you go in straight lines. And getting smaller as you draw in curves. Like the other brushes, there is an overall size multiplier, and an overall angle multiplier, but that is where the similarities end. The three variables unique to ink are the rate the size changes, the rate the tilt changes, and finally, the rate the speed changes. There is also a checkbox for smooth strokes, which have the extra variables of quality, which determines how smooth it is, and weight. This second option works very similar to hardness for regular brush types. Finally, the ink tool does not allow you to select custom brushes, but allows you to only select one of three preset images: a circle, a square, or a diamond. The last freehand drawing tool is the eraser tool. It essentially works like the opposite of the paintbrush, in the sense that it erases or subtracts from the image according to the brush pattern you set for it, whereas the paintbrush added the brush pattern on top of the image. All of the tools I have walked you through use opacity features at the very top, which function exactly like opacity for layers. You can also allow all of the tools except for the ink tool to have a smooth stroke as well, which have the same exact variables as the ink tool smoothness feature. You can also check whether all the tools except for the ink tool have incremental opacity, which means that the opacity adds up rather than being constant. Finally, each tool has a jitter effect checkbox, which makes the brush slide out according to a variable slider. The greater the amount, the greater the spread. There is also an option on GIMP named My Paintbrush tool. However, because the paintbrush and pencil already serve very similar functions to it, we can ignore this tool. Similarly, we do not often use the dynamic options offered, so we will ignore those as well. In next week's tutorial, we will learn about tools derived from the freehand tools, such as burn, smudge, and clone, and how they are all related. Don't forget to subscribe if you found this video informative, and make sure to visit the other tutorial videos, and follow me on either Facebook or Twitter for more content.